Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So today's chapter is about, we are going to cover chapter 14 of the textbook, which is about fiscal policy. The MMT, modern monetary theory, is about what would happen in a sovereign nation, that is, if we had a currency which we were free to move. So it is a sort of an idealization in the sense that we don't have a sovereign currency for reasons that we will discuss. So some of the things that are being said are theoretical. That's how policy should work if we had a free currency. And also we can try to move towards that position. So we'll see. These are the things that you need to know about monetary and fiscal policy, and unfortunately most people who make this monetary and fiscal policy don't know these theories. So a lot of policy is made in ignorance. So this is just a copy of the chapter outline. We have two theories we will discuss. One is called functional finance and another is called sound finance. And there are some standard debates about fiscal policy and crowding out and inflation and hyperinflation and debt sustainability. On all of these issues, the MMT point of view is very different from the standard point of view. So, basically one of the things is that the idea that the debt can be so large that it is not sustainable, the government will not be able to pay it back, this is a myth. Alright, so this equation we discussed last time. The government has government spending, which is salaries that it pays to government employees and any goods that it purchases, infrastructure that it is building, everything, all the bills of the government is G. Then it also has bonds that it issued in the past on which interest payments have to be made. And this happens to be a very huge part of the government budget, more than 1/3 in Pakistan, more than the amount that we spend on the army, for example. This is the biggest portion. There are reasons why this should not be so large and why it is, but those are not subject of this chapter. So these are the spending of the government. And then the revenues come from taxes. Also, the government can sell treasury bills normally to banks, but it can also sell to other parties. So when it sells treasury bills, it generates revenue. And also it can create new high-powered money. It can just ask central bank to print more money. So these are the three sources of revenue. So taxes plus new bond issue plus new revenue. So a deficit is based on the change in the level of bonds. You already have some bonds, so it's the new bonds that you sell this year that are your revenue for this year, and the new money that you create this year is your revenue for this year. You have created a lot of money in the past and you've sold a lot of bonds in the past. That doesn't count as your current revenue. So the two positions are that the one position, which is standard, everybody believes that the government finances its expenditures by getting taxes, by selling bonds and by printing money. Now the MMT point of view is that this is an identity. that that this equation is not a causal equation. It doesn't say that the government has to raise money in order to spend it. It is just, by definition, it will automatically always be true. The government doesn't take money from somewhere to spend it. The government can just write a check without having anything in its so-called bank account, because the government is the authorized to create money. So when the government writes a check, the people who get the check will present it to the central bank. The central bank is authorized to create money. It can do what we used to say was print money, but now they say keystroke money. If a bank presents a check that I have a check from the government for 1 million rupees, so what the bank will do, the central bank can do and does do actually, is to put 1 million rupees by a keystroke, by running its computer and saying, okay, you have 1 million in your account. That's it. The account is so the money came into existence. The government didn't earn any money from some place in order to make this payment. Now what the bank also does is it debits the government account that it has. But this is an artificial transaction. The government need not have any account. So once this okay. So the principle of sound finance is that government is like any other entity, and it should have money in order to spend it. So if the government account doesn't have enough money, then the government has to raise that money from somewhere. And as long as you put this in as a rule of the game, that when the government writes a check, it should have that money in its account, then it becomes one of the rules. But it is an artificial rule. It doesn't actually, it is not really structurally relevant. So the principle of sound finance, which nearly all treasuries or ministries of finance follow, is that first we must raise money and then only we can spend it. That means that you have to have money in your account before you can write a check. This causes a huge amount of difficulty because it means that the treasury does not understand the purpose of taxation. So sound finance is that you should try to minimize the deficit, and this is also called sometimes austerity. Make sure that the amount that you're earning is, and earning is basically taxes. Printing money is not counted as earning, and selling bonds is not counted as earning by the people who advocate sound finance. As opposed to this, we have functional finance, that the government deficit number is completely irrelevant. The only issue is that we should create money as needed, we should sell bonds as needed, we should do taxation as needed by the other requirements, not by the requirements of balancing the budget. Balancing budget is complete irrelevant, red herring. So there are three attitudes towards the deficit. The deficit hawk says that you must ensure budget balances every year. The doves say that make sure that it balances over the cycle, but at any one point you can run a deficit, but only if later you will try to run a surplus to create balance. So I think UK government has recently enacted some law about how currently we are running deficits, but later we will run surpluses in order to get back to balance. The position which has been named deficit owls is that the deficit numbers do not matter. Spend whatever is needed to get full employment, to get low inflation, and to get general prosperity. So we just go through what actually happens when the government spends, because this is the mechanical details. So basically the government writes that this is my budget, I'm going to allocate this much money to this, and then it spends, it makes payments, it collects taxes. When it spends money, this money is credited to the accounts of the private banking sector. Now the private banking sector gets reserves because the government has spent money. If the private banking sector has excess reserves, remember that the reserves have to be 3 to 5%, and they also have to hold about 19% of the total assets that they have in the form of treasury bills. So once the government spends money, the banks get excess reserves. And now there are many things that can happen. Generally speaking, if the central bank doesn't do anything, which it need not, then with this excess reserves, what will happen is that the banks will try to lend these reserves. There will be no takers because there's excess, and so the interest rate on this reserves will be driven to zero. If the central bank wants to keep the interest rate up, then it will have to mop up this excess reserve, and it does this by selling bonds to the banks so that the excess reserves are absorbed and the bonds are sold at the desired rate, so that the interest rate on interbank lending becomes equal to the policy rate. So this is how mechanically things happen. So the central bank has basically two choices, assuming that we are at equilibrium before the government made any spending. So now the excess reserves have been spent. So now either the bank will mop up all this excess reserve, and then the bonds will be sold at the policy rate, or you can let the interest rate go to zero. If you let the interest rate go to zero, there will be excess reserves in the banks. All the new money will be high-powered money, which has been created by the central bank, and there will be no mop-up. So in the first case, all of the new government spending will be financed by the sales of bonds, and in the second case, it will be financed by the creation of high-powered money. From some points of view, this doesn't matter. I mean, whether you finance it by money creation or whether you finance it by bonds, for some economic issues like inflation, this doesn't matter. But it does make a difference for some other matters. So this is what we want to discuss as to what happens as a result of these policy choices by the central bank. So after the global financial crisis, the central bank wanted the banks to keep high reserves. The private banks also wanted to maintain high reserves, because basically what had happened in the global financial crisis was that the banks had made lots of loans on assets which collapsed, like basically houses. The value of the houses collapsed, so the loans could not be recovered, and so they increased the level of reserve holding. So in that situation, then the central bank basically set interest rates very low, almost zero. It was 0.25% or something like that for a long time, which basically meant that you weren't earning any money on reserves. So whether the banks hold money as reserves or whether they hold bonds, this decision depends on many factors: how much reserves the banks want, how much liquidity is needed by the households, and also central bank policy decisions. But one thing that is important is that the government does not decide that we will fund our spending by selling bonds or by printing money. This is actually a monetary policy decision. Okay, so now we go to this theory of functional finance, which was introduced in 1940s and 50s by Lerner. And basically, his key idea is that the sovereign money is the creation of the state, which is the central idea of modern monetary theory as well. And functional finance means that government fiscal policy, which is the spending of the government and the taxation of the government, and its borrowing from private banks, and the repayment of loans, and the borrowing means selling of T-bonds, and the issue of new money, and the government can also destroy money when loans are repaid. The money is extinguished. All of these things should be done by understanding what happens to the economy as a result, and not by trying to balance budgets, which is meaningless operation, because money is a creation of the state, so we can create as much as we like. There is no issue that our taxes should equal to the amount of money we create. This is an artificial and unnecessary constraint. So one principle of functional finance is that create as much money as is needed to keep the prices stable. If you print too much money, then the prices will go up. If you print too little, the prices would go down. So basically, goods are being produced, money is being produced. You should produce money in just the right amount to make sure that the prices are stable. Taxation is never to be done because you need money in order to pay your bills. So it should be done only because to basically mop up extra money. If the government for some reason needs to spend more money that then is allowable by if the government spends too much, this will destabilize prices by pushing the prices up. So the government now needs to tax money to mop up the money in order that the prices remain stable. So the functional finance principle is completely rejects the sound finance and the principle of trying to balance the budget. This will be a big surprise to the Ministry of Finance if we said that. So basically, functional finance says that make sure you spend enough to eliminate unemployment, but not too much to cause inflation. So the way to do that is that if the total spending is too low to create full employment, increase the spending, and if the spending is too high and will cause inflation, then you should use taxation. But this is a little bit confusing because both things can be needed, that you need to spend and you need to tax. And to understand what's going on, you need to look at the sectors of the economy. Some sectors will be fully occupied and fully employed. If you spend on those, you will cause inflation. So basically, you have to look sector by sector. You look at the sectors in which there is unutilized capacity, and you spend on those. And those sectors where there's excess money, for example, quite often it happens that in real estate and in land there is too much money in that sector, and that causes inflation of land prices and real estate. So you should impose heavy taxes on lands and property to prevent that inflation, and you should use that money to spend in sectors where there is excess capacity. So that's for full employment and inflation. In addition, monetary policy can be used to control the interest rate, as we have seen, and so the interest rate should be controlled at a level which leads to a desirable level of investment. Currently, for example, the interest rate is so high that many types of investment cannot take place, and that's harmful for the economy. But according to the principles of sound finance, this is necessary, because if we allow interest rates to decline, what will happen is that people will borrow money and will invest in sectors in which there is already full capacity, and that will lead to inflation. So we are differentiating between standard theory and functional finance. So in functional finance, you do all of these three things for three different purposes, and there is no coordination between them. But in standard theory, you're trying to balance the budget, make sure that the government has enough money to spend, and so for that purpose, you're trying to sell bonds to the public. You are restricted from creating high-powered money. So in order to sell bonds, you have to give them high rates of interest, and that does cause reduction in investment. So currently we are not following principles of functional finance. This is how it ought to be in a world in which there is sovereign currency, but currently we do not even have a sovereign currency. So if we followed the principle of functional finance, it would cause problems in the economy, because we don't have a sovereign currency. So there is a standard theory of crowding out, which says that there is a pool of money which is the savings of the private sector, which is available for investment. If the government sells bonds to the public to earn money to pay for its projects, then this money will not be available for investment. So this is called the loanable funds theory, that there is a set of funds which can be loaned. It can be loaned either to the government or to the private sector for investment. And so if you loan these funds to the government at high rates of interest, then you will not be then the investment will go down. So this theory is wrong. This is not how the world works. What happens is that when the government spends, money comes into existence. Now the loans are not when the government spends, what happens is, actually you have to be very precise, the banks acquire reserves. Reserves of the bank are not related to the money supply directly. This is the key point which is not understood. So the standard theory written in your textbook says that reserves, high-powered reserves, the money supply is just a multiplier of the high-powered reserve. So suppose that your reserve requirement is 5% as it is in Pakistan. That means that for each rupee of currency, the reserve that the bank has, you can create 19 rupees, and so the money supply will be 20 times the high power reserve. This theory is wrong. So the reserves that the bank hold is very indirectly related to the total money supply. The total money supply is high powered money plus the amount of money which is created by the banks as loans to the private sector. Now the loans to the private sector depend on a lot of different factors. One of these is the interest rate, but it also depends on how the economy is doing. For example, if the interest rate is very high but the economy is doing very well and inflation rate is also high, so the investment might take place because the people who invest say that yes, we will pay 10% on the interest, but we will be able to make 20% because the prices will be going up, and so there will be inflation. So for example, in the real estate sector, they might be happy to, if the prices are going up at 20% and the bank is lending at 10%, they might make investment. So basically, when the private sector wants to invest, they borrow from the bank. The bank will lend them money regardless of the reserve position because they can create reserves to make lendings. So these two things are de-linked. So the amount of investment that takes place does not depend on the level of reserves in the banking sector, but it does depend to some extent on the interest and the inflation and the prospects for the economy. So the crowding out hypothesis, which says that when the government sells bonds, this displaces the money that is going into buying bonds will not be available for private loans. This theory is wrong. But crowding out does take place in a different way. If the government offers a very high rate of return on its bonds, then people will then investments which cannot earn that much interest will no longer be made. And so this is not crowding out in the traditional sense, but it is crowding out in another sense. Okay, I have explained this slide. Basically, a lot of investment takes place due to internal funds which are held by the firms. So firms also have reserves in terms of cash, savings, and they like to use these savings to invest rather than to borrow. So if they have internal liquidity, they will make investments regardless of what the rate of interest is. So the amount of investment is not subject to crowding out in the way that the theory says. All right, now we look at different theories of inflation. So the first theory is the quantity theory of money. The more money you have, the more inflation you have. This theory was rejected by Keynes. He said that if the economy is operating at full capacity, then additional money will go to inflation. But if it is operating below capacity, then money will not lead to inflation. Now, according to the classical theory and also according to neoclassical theory, economy always operates at full capacity, and there is the labor market is subject to the law of supply and demand, so you always have full employment. And this theory is just ridiculous, but it is nonetheless what is taught in standard orthodox macro. So the standard macroeconomic theories are all built around full employment. Now, if there is less than full employment, then basically one way to understand it, one simple way, is to say that in order to run the business, you need money. And basically, in fact, Keynes said that the expenditure is done in advance for the production process. You pay the wages, you buy the inputs, the raw materials, and then you do the production, and then you sell. So typically what happens in businesses is that they borrow money in order to undertake the production, and then they sell and they get money and they pay back their loans. So for example, your shopkeeper, he normally, or even the thela wala, he will go and buy goods on credit, and then he will make the sales, and then he will repay, and sometimes even sell back the stock to the original owner. So if the money is easily available, then the businesses will run, because they will easily be able to borrow to purchase goods and inputs, and then they sell at the end of the period and they repay their loans. If the money is not available, then businesses will not be able to run. So the economy will be put into a unemployment equilibrium. So if money is easily available, then you will get to full employment, and then if there is full employment and more money is made available, then this money cannot be used to expand business, so it will only be used to inflate prices. So this theory is basically the basis for the Phillips curve, which says that there is a trade-off between unemployment and inflation. As you increase the money supply, the unemployment is lowered, but inflation is increased. If you decrease money supply, you will reduce inflation, but also you will increase unemployment.
Excuse me, sir.
Yes,
Can I ask a question?
sure.
As you said that they get the loan to start their business, and if they could not make enough money to get some benefit, and they have to return back the debt. So what's your opinion on this situation?
Yes, well, those kinds of things happens when you have disturbances in the economy. You have prices change in ways that are unexpected, and that's definitely, there is a lot of issues that arise. In fact, we'll look at some of them later, but right now I'm just looking at the basic theory. If everything prices are moving smoothly, you can foresee what the prices will be at the end of the period, so there is a stable inflation rate, then all of this works. But things can happen, so that then what will happen is that businesses will go bankrupt, they will not be able to pay their loans, and lots of many other kinds of disturbances happen. So this Phillips curve was used for policy for a while, and it worked fairly well. But then there was stagflation in the 1970s. Basically, Phillips curve worked in the 60s as the basis for the monetary policy, and it worked well. But it broke down in the 70s, and then we have already discussed the Friedman theory of expectation augmented Phillips curve. Even though this theory is wrong as an explanation of inflation, this was adopted and used for policy, and this caused a lot of damage. We also discussed in the earlier chapter on inflation the idea of hysteresis, the memory of unemployment, and the conflict theory of inflation, which provides for a type of a Phillips curve, but rather different from both the original Phillips curve and also different from Friedman's expectation augmented Phillips curve. So I'm not going to go over these theories, but these theories have been used because we discussed all of these theories in the chapter on inflation. But these theories have been used as a basis of policy, and they make a big difference in terms of how monetary policy is to be done. So, as we discussed, that the Keynesian theories led to full employment, and basically that's also the object of modern monetary theory, is to try to create full employment. Keynesian theory was part of the solution, in the sense that Keynes recognized that money is needed to get to full employment, but not the full solution, because by itself it's not enough, and we will discuss that later on in this lecture. But even the crude Keynesian theory did create full employment in the 60s, and this was a problem for capitalists, because if you look at the graphs, the capitalist profits went down, the labor share of earnings went up, and basically labor became quite strong because they had more power because of full employment policies. And so there was an ideological counterattack which was prepared in the 60s and 70s. And basically, if you read Naomi Klein book, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism, The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of... This is a very important book. I learned more from this book about economics than I learned from my PhD in economics. So I strongly recommend it. It's also it's written by a journalist, so it's very fast reading, rapid, exciting. So basically, the capitalists did not like Keynesian theories. They do not like full employment. So they created different kinds of theories, which basically again said that these theories, like Lucas says that yes, there is always full employment. This was the basic bone of contention between Keynes and classics, that classics said that there is always full employment and the free market will ensure full employment because the standard supply and demand for labor. And Keynes said, no, we have seen that there is not full employment. So he developed a theory to show that, basically he developed a theory in which less than full employment could exist and could be at least a temporary equilibrium. And the way Keynesian theory was understood, Keynesian theory was deeper than Samuelson version and other. Basically, how Keynes was understood by not post-Keynesian, but the standard neoclassical economist was that Keynes was saying that wages are rigid, so they do not adjust, so that the wages remain too high and there is excess. Because of that, there is excess supply of labor. And if the wages were to reduce, then you would get to full employment. So this is a misunderstanding of what Keynes is saying, and we have discussed that also. But this is how neoclassical economists understood it. They said in short term there is unemployment, in long term it will be wiped out. And then basically Lucas said no, in short term and in long term there is no unemployment. So he said that the labor market is always instantaneously balanced in equilibrium. So these arguments, the ideological arguments, basically argue that you should have sound finance, the government should balance budgets, this will create austerity, this will prevent the government from spending money to end unemployment, and this will strengthen the position of the capitalists for two reasons. One reason is that there is unemployment, so the labor is weak and can easily be exploited. And the other reason is that when interest rates are high, then the financial lobby can get lots of money on its capital, and this will happen when the government restricts the. See, the government is the natural creator of money, but the financial sector also creates money. So if the government is creating a lot of money, the financial sector will not be able to earn high returns. But if the government is creating less money, which is what happens when you use austerity, then the financial lobby will create lots of money and will get huge returns, and that's what's been happening over the past 30 years, in the sense that all of the money has been concentrated in the financial sector, and the real sector is getting starved of money. So basically, in the classical economics, there was the concept of that there are some parasites, they earn money without doing any work, and then there's the real sector. So the financial lobby has managed to make it so that the parasites are earning all the money and the real sector is earning very little. And they have even erased this distinction from economic theory. So now you don't even see it. So what happened in the 1970s was that there was a rise in oil prices, which led to a cost push inflation. This was interpreted as misinterpreted by the monetarists as a demand pull inflation, and then austerity policies were taken to counter the inflation, and so these led to stagflation. Both inflation continued to occur, but the austerity also created unemployment, so you got both unemployment and inflation at the same time. In Australia, they created a tax on goods and services. So this countered the inflation, but they also negotiated with labor unions to moderate the wage demands to avoid the conflict that leads to inflation. And so basically, by adjusting the demands for the wage increase and by adjusting the aggregate demand and by preventing the conflict between labor and capitalist, there was a one-time price increase, but no inflationary process was set into motion. So in Australia, inflation was controlled. So now, this is in response to the question that you raised about what happens if the capitalists of the firms end up making losses. We need price stability to prevent that. Either prices can be stable at some fixed level, this is the desirable thing, or if there is inflation but everybody knows that there is going to be 10% inflation, then this doesn't really cause any problems, because everybody can factor this into their plans, and so you can compensate for this, and you can make plans, and you can make profits, and you can calculate how much money I could need to spend in order to how much make. So as long as inflation is anticipated, then it doesn't cause problem. What problems are created are by unanticipated inflation. So if there is high inflation, like in Pakistan, inflation has been picking up. Recently it was 3% last year, now it's around 6%. So the general policy response is austerity, which means you should tighten the budget, you should increase the interest rates. So the question is, this is based on basically sound finance principles, but as the textbook says, that this is not the right response to high inflation. So austerity does, basically if you balance budgets, what happens is that money creation is reduced, and that will cut into the availability of money supply. It will also cut into investment. So inflation will be reduced, but it will also cause further unemployment. And so you solve one problem by making the other one worse. Basically, post-70s stagflation has been the typical issue in economies, and the textbook illustrates this by the popularity of the misery index, which is just the sum of unemployment and inflation. It's not a good measure, it adds two different things, but this is just to illustrate that this has been a common problem that we have had, both unemployment and inflation. Now, as I said, that basically there is ideological opposition to full employment by capitalists, but they cannot express this openly. So what they do is they say that government should balance budgets, and MMT is made out to say that the government should spend unlimitedly, even though this is not actually a contention of MMT. As the authors of the textbook repeatedly say, MMT is just describing the state of affairs. So far, it's not really making policy prescriptions about how much the government should spend, except that it should spend it in the right way. But what that right way is, we haven't specified. But people who oppose MMT say that, oh, the MMT says the government should just spend freely. So this is not true. MMT also says that if you spend freely, that will also lead to inflation. So the basic principle, okay, so now we come to policy. So what should be done? How much money should be spent? Well, if there is insufficient aggregate demand, then you should, that is, the economy is operating with unemployment, which you can see by looking at jobless workers, and you can look at underutilized capacity in factories, then that is insufficient aggregate demand. And so this is when you should spend more. The other place where you should spend more is if you have interest rates are too high, as is currently the case. If the interest rates are too high, this means that the banks do not have enough reserves, or that the central bank is maintaining a high policy rate. So in both cases, the government should spend more, but the problem is that you need to consider the sectors of the economy, as I said earlier. You can get higher aggregate demand by cutting taxes, or by spending more, or by doing both, or by spending more and increasing taxes less. So how should this be done? This requires careful policy making, and this is where Keynes was not quite right, in the sense that the aggregate tools don't work, that if you the government just spends more without what you call helicopter money, the standard policy, we just drop money all over the economy and use taxation to mop up excess. This doesn't work, because this will work if there is general depression all across the economy, then all the sectors will pick up. But if that's not the case, which is typically the case, some sectors are tight, some sectors are slack, then as you spend, the sectors which are tight, which are full employment, there will be inflation. And this will happen a lot before the time that you get to full employment. So as you spend money, you will start creating inflation much before you get to full employment. So you need to have differential spending. You need to spend in those sectors where there is excess capacity. You need to spend more on those sectors where there is no excess capacity, but you want to create excess capacity. In such situations, what will happen is that there will be inflation in that sector, prices will go up. The price going up gives the signal that this is a profitable sector and more capacity should be created, and then more capacity will be created. So even inflation by itself is not necessarily a bad thing. It provides the signals that are needed to increase or to build capacity in that sector. So anyway, the point is that this is this is not just helicopter money does not work, and that is why, in fact, Keynesian policies were counterattacked because of this helicopter money weakness, that general spending will lead to full employment. This doesn't happen, and general spending will lead to inflation. This does happen, and that is what was used by Friedman and Chicago School and monetary theorists to counterattack against Keynesian theory. So we have to do better Keynesian theory, and that is modern monetary theory. So this was what the critique was of Friedman, that there are long and variable lags in response to policy, Keynesian monetary policy. If we just push more money into the economy, this is not necessarily going to have good results. First of all, it takes us a long time to recognize the need for policy. Then it takes a long time to make the policy. Then it takes a long time to respond to policy, and by that time the economy will already have arrived at equilibrium, so your policy will be having the effect of destabilizing the economy. So that's what was the general Friedman critique, and more or less it's valid if you have a general aggregate non-differentiated policy. So what we need is targeted fiscal policy. We need to give money to the sectors which are in need, and what the book says is that the right scheme is the job guarantee scheme, directly to those people who need it. So now, and not in the form of the BISP program, which just gives people money to buy food. People should be given jobs so that they are productively employed and paid for the job, so that when you give money, this adds to the production. So automatically the money is being directed at the unemployment and the unutilized capacity. Now there are many kinds of mismatches that can occur in the job guarantee. First of all, one has to work carefully to avoid corruption, in the sense that, okay, we are providing job guarantees. If somebody comes in and does a job, we want to make sure that this is a productive job, so that it adds to the economic output. Otherwise, if the person just is listed on the payrolls, like happened in the steel mills, that thousands of workers were added to the payrolls, and they pick up the check at the end of the month, but they never show up, then this kind of thing can happen in any kind of job guarantee program. So this has to be prevented. The other kind of problem that arises is that there are mismatches. We give a job guarantee, the person is an engineer, but he gets employed as a sweeper. This can happen, because job guarantees are normally given for low-paying jobs. But the fundamental problem, so there may be some sectors which are in which have undercapacity. They can hire all sorts of people, and some sectors are operating at full capacity. So people who are specialized in one job may need to learn other kind of job skills and things like that. So these are second-order problems, not primary problem. So one of the themes of the general theory of employment, which Keynes wrote, in fact, the word general theory says that all of neoclassical theory is built on the assumption of full employment and works all right when there is full employment, but does not work when there is unemployment. So creating full employment is a very important target, because in that case, once you have full employment, then the market economy works well. But if you don't have full employment, the market economy does not work well, and we need to make interventions to get to full employment. And this general point is not understood. So the ideological debate that takes place is that the capitalists do not like full employment because it makes the workers strong, it gives them unions, it allows them to push wages high. And remember that this is not a one-sided picture. The laborers, when they get power, they ask for more than their share, and then the firm cannot work at that share. What the firm does is, okay, it gives them more than their share, and then it jacks up the prices. But this is not always possible, and so the firm may collapse, or the business efficiency might decline for various reasons. So it's always the situation is that there is a battle between two opposing parties, both of whom are self-interested. So there is no fair point of view easily available. So the ideological battle, the capitalists argue that if we allow the governments to spend to create full employment, this will lead to wild overspending by the government. Look at these politicians, they are always trying to spend money. So actually, when you look at the historical evidence, it is not true that the governments do wild overspending. Even now, you see the government, the battle in the US government, the shutdown, and this has happened in the past also, is because the government is very strongly insisting on balancing budget. If you just print money to finance the Trump wall, there will be no budget crisis. But what could happen is that inflation would take place, and the government generally represents the interests of the rich and the powerful, who do not want inflation to erode the value of their financial assets, because it's the rich people who have financial assets, and the real assets do not erode in value because the real assets have real value. But basically, if the rich people basically the wealthy are the loaners, the creditors. There is a battle between creditors and debtors. So the wealthy, the people who have money, are the creditors. They have given loans of money, and the debtors are the people, they're poor. They have borrowed money. So if the value of money goes up, if the value of money goes down by inflation, which is what will happen if the government overspends, then the debtors will improve their position and the creditors will deprove. And so the rich and powerful do not want inflation, and so they argue for austerity, they argue for budget balance. And so the idea that if we allow the government to spend, there will be wild overspending is not really true. This doesn't happen. And the current budget shutdown is an example of why the government did not want to overspend, did not want to create inflation. All over the world, the governments operate under budget constraints, artificial budget constraints. These are artificial rules of the game, but they still do, precisely because they are afraid that inflation will happen. I mean, these rules have been imposed by the wealthy, the financial lobby, to make sure that governments don't get out of control. If by some mistake some popular government comes into power, like Imran Khan, then their hands will be bound, and they will not be able to spend to provide food for all the people. So MMT does not support irresponsible spending. Excessive government spending in the wrong sectors will lead to inflation. But basically, one of the arguments that is used to argue against giving power to the governments is hyperinflation. That's a scarecrow. If there is a hyperinflation, then the whole economy gets destroyed. But against this warning, you should also think about the dangers of underspending, which are never mentioned. If the government does not spend enough, then there's underutilization of capacity. So you have a perfectly good economy, you have lots of laborers, they're out of work. If we could put them to work, we could substantially increase the production that takes place in the economy. So this is called the output gap, the gap between what could be produced and what is being produced. So today, what is happening is that the state bank estimates the output gap to be zero, or even so. Economy is at maximum production. Now this is a mystery. Why is our state bank? And so the state bank says that if we spend more money, then we will create excess demand, aggregate demand, and this will lead to inflation. So now this is a mystery, because we have lots of unemployed labor and lots of underutilized capacity. So basically what happens is that the output gap is estimated on the basis of historical patterns. So if we just use helicopter money in the economy, this money will go into sectors which are operating at full capacity. So there are two problems which the current output gap does not see, and that's why the state bank is using a tight monetary policy. One thing that is not visible in the data is the potential capacity of a sector to expand. So is it true that so that depends, and if the prices of concrete double, will we be able to produce more cement? That depends on how much more exploration can be done, how much more raw materials are available, how much more skill can be attracted. So this is something which the historical data does not show. Similarly, if we try to create jobs for the poor by rural jobs guarantee scheme, again this is something which is not part of the historical pattern. So this is output which has not been seen in the past. So it is not reflected in the past data. So the State Bank does not see any gap there. But if we were to create this output and then economy, if these people were to become unemployed, then we would see, oh, in the past there were jobs and now these jobs are not there. So there is unutilized capacity. So for those reasons, the underspending is also a problem, but it is not so visible because both of these things, the potential expansion which will be created by allowing inflation in a certain sector, this is not something which is part of Keynesian policy, because when you talk about inflation, you're talking about general economy-wide inflation, and that's not going to help anything. But if we pump money into a sector because we want to get expansion in capacity, this will not happen immediately. It will take a while, and you have to push this policy for sufficiently long that people see that, oh yes, this is something that's going to persist. So these new set of prices are stable, so we can afford to build plants and expand policy. If this is just a temporary price blip, nobody is going to build capacity in response to that. So that's one thing that's not visible in the data, but it is a danger of underspending. And then the other thing is, of course, unutilized capacity, which the informal sector, which has never been formalized, this doesn't get seen in the official numbers, so you don't see an output gap. If there is an increase in unemployment in the informal sector, that doesn't get seen. Yes?
So isn't there also a problem of how potential output itself is calculated or estimated?
Yes. It's partly it's because output gap is calculated on the basis of historical data. Partly it's also because informal economy is not included in it. Yes. So arguments are made against MMT that it will just encourage wild spending. So the critics say that we should not use high-powered money to finance deficits. So the MMTers say that it is spending which creates high-powered money and not the reverse. So it's just a foolish thing to say that we can't use. I mean, spending is equal to high-powered money. So you cannot de-link the two, that first we create high-powered money and then spending is another name for high-powered money. And then the standard theory, we have already discussed this, is that high-powered money is multiplied to create money, and therefore deficits are automatically inflationary. Again, this is not true. There is no automatic link between the total amount of money, M2, and the high-powered money, and there is no automatic multiplier. There is a demand for loans, but this depends on a lot of complicated factors. We've already discussed this. So, what does the central bank do? We've already discussed this question, that they set the discount rate. The discount rate also creates a split between high-powered money and T-bills, because they have to in order to maintain the policy rate, they have to sell or buy. They have to either mop up liquidity or they have to pump in liquidity, because once they set a discount rate, then the banks have to maintain a certain amount of reserve ratio. The reserve ratio they maintain is in accordance with the demand for loans. which doesn't depend on the factors that we are currently discussing. So there is a split. I mean, there's a proportion of money which is held as T-bills, the proportion held as cash. But this is an effect of monetary policy. This is not an effect of the deficit. So why am I saying this? Because the general picture is that the government has to choose between financing deficits via high-powered money or by selling bonds to raise money for the public. So basically, the illusion is that either we can borrow from the central bank or we can borrow from the public. But this is not true. High-powered money is what is government spending, and then this is divided between bonds and high-powered money according to the central bank monetary policy. So this is the right picture, which is not understood. And the other part of the MMT argument is that deficits do not lead to inflation, and the argument is given that of Japan, which has high deficits, low interest rates, low inflation, and low unemployment. And the text says that even though unemployment is between 3.5 to 5.5, the government could also spend even more to reduce unemployment without actually causing inflation. So deficit creates high-powered money, but high-powered money is not directly linked to inflation. All right, so finally, these are the standard methodology. If anyone talks about MMT, people say, oh, that will lead to hyperinflation because the government will just spend wildly and that will create hyperinflation. So the textbook discusses these because these are the standard counter arguments to MMT. So what actually did happen in hyperinflation? There were two known cases. These are very rare. One is the Weimar Republic, which was Germany between the two wars, between World War I and World War II. There was a hyperinflation in Germany, and there's Zimbabwe. So first, there is this famous paper by Philip Kagan, which gets cited all the time, about how the quantity theory of money is proven by the German hyperinflation. Basically, what we were led to believe and was that as the German banks printed money, the inflation continued exactly the same rate. But for the first time, I actually, in this text, I read that this is not really what Kagan said. So he said these things: wage increases are because inflation is so fast, and he defined it as 50% per month or more as hyperinflation. So that every day you demand your wages because, and then you go out at lunch to buy your food because buy goods because by the evening the prices will be higher. So this is what the what he said. But actually, what Kagan was saying in this paper, which I understood for the first time in this text, is that the quantity theory actually fails. So what he is, it is not that the price of money was equivalent to any rate of increase of money was equivalent to the rate of increase of price. Actually, what happened was that the velocity increased. So because you see, let's see how does it go. M times MT is equal to PV. Yeah. So the prices did not track the rate of increase of money, and to explain this problem, he had to introduce the idea that the velocity kept increasing, and that's for the reason for this picture that we are talking about, that instead of buying daily, you buy half daily and you buy quickly. So velocity keeps increasing because that's the only way you can make the quantity theory work. So actually the quantity theory doesn't even work in the hyperinflation, and in order to make it work, you have to introduce this hypothesis about velocity. Of course, you see, if you adjust the velocity to make the equation come out, then the quantity theory automatically always works. The quantity theory is an interesting hypothesis only if the velocity is stable. If the velocity is automatically adjusted to match, then it means nothing. It's automatically true. So Kagan actually paper, which is said to be a proof of quantity theory, actually is an explanation of why quantity theory failed in the hyperinflation, because and he tries to explain it by trying to explain how the velocity kept increasing so as to make the quantity theory equation work out. So there are other problems with the quantity theory. All governments run deficits. If you look at the world around, they print money. Actually, MMTers don't like to use the word print money, so they say create keystroke money, because that's what happens today. You don't actually print money, but print money is useful as a metaphor. But even though you have, since the 1970s, up until the 1970s, the quantity theory equation fits well. MV equals PT, velocities are stable. But after the 70s, you run into serious problems all over the world if you try to fit quantity equations. So there are papers called "Where is the missing money?" because there are papers which are called and there are many papers which try to explain the velocity doesn't remain constant. So when you run the equation, money is proportional to prices. Sometimes you find that there is less money. Sometimes you find too much money, and so ultimately the quantity theory equation became unstable. And this was in the 70s, 80s, 90s. Lots of papers about how to get back to stability in the money. And the best theory, one which I have asked a student or two to work on for their thesis, is what I think Richard Lerner has created, something which is called the quantity theory of credit. And he has said that the standard quantity theory equation does not take into account some factors which when you go to measure it, I mean the theory itself takes this into account, but when you try to translate it to numbers, you ignore certain things like price of land and price of stocks. This is not built into your price index, just because that's how price indexes are defined. So if the land accelerates in price and the stocks increase, this doesn't come into your price index, and so money increases and the money is being poured into land and stocks, and it doesn't go into prices, and then you say, where is the missing money? So when you take into account some of the credit, also the private money creation is not being taken into account properly, and that once you take all the missing things into account, then you can make the equation work. And this is actually the world economics is running on quantity theory of money. So if you take this tool, you can do a lot of different theses, because you just take some place where they're applying the QTM and you replace it with QTC, and you can get a new theory and a paper and research. So basically QTM has broken down. You look at the empirical evidence, and basically it argues, I haven't looked at the data themselves, that if you have floating exchange rates, then you have no currency crisis. But if your exchange rate is tied to some commitment in terms of foreign currency, either you have fixed exchange rate or you have foreign debt which is fixed, and then you have to pay that amount in a foreign currency, then basically what happens is now you no longer have a sovereign currency, and this is the case in Pakistan. So we can't directly apply the prescriptions of monetary theory until we liberate our currency from and until we liberate ourselves. The government should never take debt in foreign currency. It is always possible. This is a choice of the government, and the government should not do this in order to keep the currency sovereign. Once you take debt in foreign, you can take debt in your own currency, then there is no problem. But you cannot take debt in others' currency. And if you do, then you no longer have sovereign currency. And all of this theory now becomes inapplicable. So what people do is fix exchange rates, they put limits of deficit spending, they create currency boards. All of these are to ensure sound fiscal policy. This ties the hands of the government, forces them to undertake. This is also true in the European Union, where because of the common currency, the fiscal policy of all of the governments is ensured. They are all supposed to keep their deficits within 3%, and many other rules they have to follow, because they are not sovereign, because they don't have sovereign currency. So this causes massive problems, and countries which can't keep up, like Greece or Ireland or Spain, they run into trouble because they cannot have their free fiscal and monetary policy. So what the idea of these constraints is that this will force the government to follow sound practice, but what world experience shows is that this cannot be done. What happens is that the governments go into involuntary default, to bankruptcy, into financial crisis, because the idea that if I am prudent, I can always run a sound fiscal policy. This is not true. The economy forces you to do things which take you out of the safe zone, and so the idea that everybody can always do sound fiscal policy, this is wrong. So the causes of the currency crisis are, generally speaking, obligations in foreign currencies. And so the Weimar Republic had went into hyperinflation because they had too many commitments they had to meet. Basically, the World War I, at the end of World War I, Germany was forced to pay massive reparations. They had to pay 50 billion marks to the winning countries, and even Keynes wrote a book called The Economic Consequence of Peace, in which he said that they will run out of money and then they will have to go to war, and this is exactly what happened. And even he calculated that it would take them about 20 years, and that's exactly the period of time that to the Second World War, between 1918 and 1942. So because they had to meet their obligations in foreign debt, the capacity of the Germany economy to produce was destroyed. So what was needed to be done was that they had to sell goods to raise gold, and the payments had to be made in gold, and then they had to pay gold, and there simply was not enough there. So they resorted to printing money. They could not raise taxes. There was not economy was destroyed, and this excessive creating of money led to a hyperinflation. The Irish Republic also ran into big crisis, because when they were prosperous, they took debt in euros, both the public and the private sector, and then they were hit by a crisis, and then they had liabilities. Same thing happened in Greece. East Asian crisis also had the same problem. They had the economy was very prosperous, and so there was a lot of foreign investment, and the government took debt in foreign currencies, and the private sector took debt in foreign currencies, and then when the crisis hit, they were unable to pay back.
Sir,
Yes.
so in Pakistan, we get loan from foreign countries in which currency?
Well, basically, recent loans, I think they have been in via currency swap agreements, so they are not damaging. Now, in the past, loans have been always in dollars. That's the standard practice. All right, so I think we are out of time, but basically, if you look at the history and you look at the details of the hyperinflation, you find that it's very complicated, and there's no one big theory which will fit it. Same thing true of Zimbabwe, and same thing is true of East Asia. There are many, many different factors, but the most important factor is the existence of debt in foreign exchange, which is the source of the problem. And this is something which can be avoided and should be avoided in order to make safe currency. One thing, additional thing that I would like to add here is that in order to study economics, you need to study history. This is one major failing of modern macroeconomics. In fact, I gave a talk which you might want to listen to at Ibn Khaldun University in Turkey about how we need to launch a revolution in the teaching of economics. And so it discusses the micro and the macro. In the macro, basically, I think the target that we should have in teaching macro courses is that the student should understand why the Great Depression occurred and what were the theories that emerged to explain the Great Depression and East Asian crisis, global financial crisis, the 70s stagflation. These are the things that you need to understand. Unfortunately, the methodology which emerged for economics, which was adopted in the 90s, said that economics is a universal science. It's a set of laws which will operate in all circumstances. So there's a book called How Economics Forgot History by Jeffrey Hodgson. We need to have history. Now, it's also true that history by itself is not enough. And history is just a sequence of facts. X happened, then Y happened, then Z happened. That doesn't give explanation. So for explanation, you need theories. So it's not that you can dispense with theories, you just do history. But theories are, we don't have universal theories which will work in all times and place. So you have to work in a compromise. You have to look at history and you have to develop a local theory which works for that period according to those times. And then for a different time, you might need a different theory. At this point, we don't have the knowledge required to create universal theories. So we need to look especially at specific places and times, and the theory for Pakistan today that is relevant for monetary will not be the same as the theory which was valid for Great Britain after the Depression. Today we are using something like this, one theory for all, one size fits all, and this is why we are running into very serious problems in policy making. And this is something that you can do. That is what I want my students to learn. This is a wide open sphere. The economists, the macroeconomists all over the world, they don't know history because they have never been taught. Except the smart ones, they go and learn it on their own, and then they are able to do. But this is not something which is taught to anyone. So if you learn history, you will be a much better economist, you will have much better understanding. And also, people complain about my courses that, if we teach unorthodoxy, you will do badly in interviews. Actually, those people who know history do much, much better than in interviews than those people who don't. When people are asked in interviews a question about the Pakistan economy, they talk about ISLM curves. They don't have any knowledge about what is really the ground realities. And so learning history, learning about data, learning about reality does help a lot in actually doing good in interviews. So from a practical job point of view, it's also useful, but also from a theoretical point of view, this is a major deficiency in existing macroeconomics, and I would like my students to go and create new courses which integrate history with theory in the correct way. The theory is also wrong, as I said. The theory which is being taught is based on full employment, which is wrong. We do have the right theories available, but these are just beginnings. You need to build on them to get to the